electronic devices. All electronic devices should be switched off, excluding the tablet devices that you're using to view your committee pack. Very loud.
Yeah, sort itself out.
All right. Just members, a brief overview of today's business. We are in a single item agenda, which is the briefing from the Minister for Employment and Learning on the budget 15-16. Members, apologies. No apologies.
Apology from William Irwin, Chair of
Agriculture. Members, chairperson's business, there is none at this minute in time. And members, will move on then straight into the reason for today's meeting is the ministerial briefing, an update on 15-16 budget. Again, remind members, we are covered by Hansard.
Yeah.
And just could you turn off all your electronic devices as they will interfere with the recording. Members, we have just been tabled just before we started with a briefing from the Minister on the Department into his budget. They are headline figures, as note. We will note, Minister, and again we thank you for coming at this short notice. Of course we would have liked more detail, but our timeline and your timeline is met today, and this is where we are at this minute in time. Can I just welcome on behalf of the committee Dr. Stephen Farry, the Minister for Employment and Learning, Mr. Derek Beggar, Permanent Secretary, Ms. Heather Cousins, Deputy Secretary, and Mr. Stephen McBurney, Director of Finance. Minister, as I said, you're very welcome to the committee. Thank you for taking your time today. I heard your comments on radio this morning, and I hope no member of this committee today sends out mixed signals to you in regard to this budget. And it's something we have taken serious deliberation over and serious concern on. So I'll ask you to open your meeting with your brief comments.
Okay, Chair. Thank you very much for the invitation along to address the committee today. This is very much our current advanced thinking in relation to the final budget for the department. I appreciate the budget was agreed by the Executive as recently as the 15th of January. And we're still working through the precise detail in that regard. It is our plan to finalise the budget for the department within the next few days, but in many respects this gives the committee today the opportunity to give its own final views in advance of the department itself reaching its final conclusion on the way forward. We have provided you, as you've alluded to, Chair, with a brief summary. We opted to keep the paper simple, given that we were in a situation that we were tabling the paper to the committee. This is the potential final department budget position, and the figures here do provide us with a balanced budget position for the forthcoming financial year. There are aspects beneath that we can perhaps clarify our thinking on today. There will be aspects, however, that will require some deeper working through, particularly in relation to higher education and further education, where the absolute outworkings lie outside the control of the department. They might very much lie with the sectors themselves. Excuse me, but we will have some degree of the direction of travel in that regard. Now, obviously, the position in the final budget is better than in the draft budget. And we welcome the allocation of an additional 20 million, though that can also be considered as an allocation back to the department, or rather a reduced cut to the department. It's also worth noting that we have received 13.2 million in terms of successful bids to the Change Fund, and that this department received 44% of the overall fund. And can I say that I think is a recognition of the creativity and ingenuity of our own officials in terms of making bids to that fund, and also a recognition of the fact that the department is very keen to engage in collaboration with other departments, and that I think was reflected in how our bids were received in relation to the Change Fund. I think it's important to say at the outset that the increased allocations to the department do not address all of the budget challenges that are facing the department, and as I will indicate shortly, we are still facing some very difficult decisions with some very significant implications for frontline services and indeed investment in skills. Just to talk you through the handout itself at this stage. You will note our closing budget position for 2014 and 15, which obviously includes the jobs and economy money, Pathways to Success and the Youth Employment Scheme funds. That's 791 million. With the loss of those monies, our opening budget-based line for 15-16 was therefore just over 756 million, and the final budget position is 707 million, 708 million to be precise.
Sorry, Minister, can I just interrupt? Members, could you please check mobile phones and turn them off, because we are having, and the public gallery, you shouldn't have any phones in, but we are getting feedback and it's interfering with the recordings. So.
Okay. So the cut to the department against the opening baseline is 48.3 million. You then have to take into account the change fund allocation, excuse me, of 13.2 million, which is of course earmarked for specific new programmes and commitments. Which means that the effective cut to the department to be addressed is 61.5 million. And obviously, you can see how the 20 million reallocation has reduced the overall pressure from 82 million to 61 million. These figures, again, do not take into account any pay and price inflation. You will recall from the draft departmental savings plans that we indicated a number of areas where some reductions had already been identified. And that left a balance of 49 million in terms of the initial draft budget. And we highlighted that was to be addressed through cuts to the higher education and further education budgets, with obvious implications for jobs and places in universities and colleges, and also further exploration of any mitigating actions. What we're now proposing to do is to confirm the 33.2 million of initially identified reductions. Just to draw your attention as well, there's some other pressures that have come to us which we need to take into account, and those include match funding in relation to the European Social Fund and also the Community Family Support Programme, which members have found very effective. And then removing the additional 20 million allocation leaves a pressure of 30.1 million. It's therefore proposed to address that as follows, with 14 million of reductions from higher education, 12 million from further education and 4.1 million in terms of further departmental efficiencies and reductions. So that's how we balance out what is the remaining pressure of 30.1 million if we accept the 33.2 of previously identified reductions. It might be useful just to give some further elaboration around what all that means. First of all, in terms of higher education, we're talking about a cut to both the core teaching grant and research grant for each of the higher education institutions. We're not in a position today to specify the specific cuts to each of the institutions. There's a number of different aspects that would still need to be bottomed out. Just to give you one example, on the back of the REF results in December, that changes the formula for allocation of QR funding to universities. We're waiting to see how HEFCA, are currently discussing that, literally as we speak in London, reach a decision on what the standard is for any reallocations between universities based upon the outcomes of those. It will then be for the universities to work through the implications of the cuts and what they mean for places and jobs, and it may well be a number of weeks before we understand the full implications in that regard. But at this stage, to be very clear, Chair, it is inevitable that there will be an impact in terms of the front line, given the scale of what we are reluctantly having to pass on to the sector. However, we have sought to mitigate the impact on the front line through a number of measures. First of all, we've asked the universities themselves to maximise their own internal efficiencies. Secondly, we have agreed to relax the minimum requirements to spend 20% of additional student fee income on widening participation measures to 10%. In essence, an input-based process will be replaced by a new outcome-based process to maintain at the very least, current standards. This will be a condition in relation to what is in effect a deregulation in relation to widening participation. This change could free up to around about £8 million in spending power for the institutions, which can be used to protect the front line to some extent. So in essence, what we're proposing to do there is to move from an input process where spend has to be required up front to asking the universities to have an outcome-based process based upon the self-same standards that we have today, but giving them the freedom to work out how they achieve those themselves. Finally, we've also reached an understanding with universities to protect narrow STEM places, and also we have encouraged them to protect PhDs and research investments as far as is possible. With respect to further education, we're talking of a £12 million reduction. This will be partially mitigated by the proposed use of £6 million in end-of-year flexibility, which of course will be subject to the agreement of the Executive. In effect, this is the use of reserves within the sector. This leaves a balance of £6 million, and it will be for the respective boards of governors to agree on how the various cuts to the colleges will be managed. But from our engagement with the sector over the past few weeks, we can anticipate that the savings may be found through some of the following measures. For example, Belfast Met will standardise the approach to ESOL in line with other colleges, which should save £0.2 million. In terms of essential skills, falling demand will allow us to save about £0.5 million. We are proposing that all leisures and hobbies courses will be at full cost recovery, that subsidies in that regard will end, which should save in the region of £3 million. We're proposing to end the Learner Access and Engagement Programme, which has had low enrolment levels, plus we believe that there are alternative programmes out there that are covering the same ground. We're proposing that there should be a standardisation of tuition fees in terms of the colleges. At present, Belfast Met and CERC are charged £2,500, and the other four are charging in the region of £1,500. And it is our intention that those be harmonised across the board. Of course, the fees for higher education and further education are still significantly lower than in the context of universities. And that should leave a residual figure of £0.3 million for the colleges themselves to find. They also will benefit to an extent from the relaxation around widening participation. It's also worth noting that the colleges will be best placed to access the £7.5 million allocation in the Change Fund for the pilots in relation to the apprenticeship strategy. They should be the provider of choice for business for level 3 through to level 5, and that's where we anticipate most of the initial growth to be occurring. So that's an opportunity for the colleges, and hopefully they will be able to avail of that. Again, with those measures, there will be some impact in terms of places and also jobs. And again, as is the case with higher education, it may be a number of weeks before things fully work through in that regard. In terms of other efficiencies, there are a number of programmes, for example, EMA commitments and apprenticeship NI, where different levels of demand may allow us to make savings in the region of about £1.5 million. We're also proposing savings in terms of OFTET, which is the Fair Employment Tribunals, of £0.3 million, and further internal savings of the Department of £2.3 million. So that creates the residual £4.1 million in order for the budget to balance. You will be familiar with the bids we've made in relation to the Change Fund United Youth programme pilot phase of £3 million, and we've now advanced the rollout of those pilots, which I know was a concern for a lot of people. £7.5 million in relation to apprenticeships and youth training. We have £2 million in relation to a collaborative skills investment alongside our colleagues in Invest NI, who with £7 million coming from DETI alongside £2 million allocated to this department. And there's also money in relation to an essential skills programme that we intend to take forward in conjunction with the Department of Education. It's also worth noting that our capital resources have fallen from £55 million down to £33 million, and that obviously will have implications for what can be done in terms of higher education and further education. In conclusion, Chair, I just want to make a few general comments and just to reiterate the approach that we have taken. We have sought to protect those areas that are most relevant to the economy. We have sought to protect services to those who are most vulnerable in society. We've looked at previous spending patterns, assessed evolving trends and expectations around demand. We have sought to reduce departmental administration and indeed explore how some services can be delivered differently. We've encouraged efficiencies in both the higher education and further education sectors. We've sought to address duplication and deadweight and also to explore alternative funding arrangements. And some of the practical outworkings of that have included a commitment to seek to protect narrow STEM subjects, which are so vital to the economy. The Assured Skills Programme, which is vital for our inward investment initiatives, to protect our new system of apprenticeships and youth training, to protect the employment service in terms of how we deal with those who are unemployed. And in terms of student support, we have not altered any of the programmes in terms of eligibility and thresholds. So that, again, is proceeding as is the case before. So hopefully, Chair, that gives you an idea as to our advanced thinking in this regard. And again, we'll hopefully close this out over the coming days and forward on formal confirmation to the committee and other stakeholders in that regard. And at this stage, we're happy to take any comments and questions from members.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Members, as I said before, open just one question per member, followed up by a supplementary, and we'll do a number of rounds just so everybody gets a chance to do that. Minister, 26 million been removed from higher and further education. I know you say it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks before you work out numbers. In your initial draft budget paper, you were able to say it was going to cost 1,100 jobs, 16,000 FE places and 1,100 HE places. Have you a gut feeling?
Well, first of all, those figures were provided by the sectors themselves, not by the department, so that was their indication to us as to what a 10.8% cut across the board would mean in that regard. Now, if we deal with higher education first, we're still looking at what is a headline figure of 14 million for them. Now, to some extent, what is new is the different approach we're taking in relation to widening participation, which, while it doesn't actually transfer money back to them, it should increase their spending power, potentially to the tune of around about 8 million. That is our estimate. In practice, it may come in somewhat less than that, but that is what we believe that the additional spending power will be, and that can be used to mitigate the level of cuts. That still obviously leaves a pressure of around 6 million. That hopefully some of that can be absorbed through the universities doing things differently, but we're still prone to a potential loss of places in that regard. It may be in terms of the low hundreds at this stage, and depending on how effective they can be in terms of finding other efficiencies themselves, that figure may come down over the coming weeks, and we're committed to working with them to see what more we can do in that regard. I mean, ultimately, throughout this, we are very mindful of keeping the loss of the frontline places to the barest minimum. That's what I believe is the front-facing aspect of what the department does, and what's most important for providing skills for the economy. So that's something that we're very mindful of. In terms of the FE sector, obviously 6 million of the 12 million that we've allocated for reductions to that sector may be addressed through the end-year flexibility. Now, we have a commitment that money can be drawn down. It's not factored into the budget at present that was struck by the Executive, so we will have to go and seek that through the various monitoring rounds over the course of the next 12 months. So that in itself isn't guaranteed. It depends upon recommendation from DFP and agreement by the Executive around timing, though the principle that the money of FE is accepted. So in effect, we're using the reserves of the sector. That still leaves a pressure again for them in the region of about £6 million. We have probably a fairer understanding, given that we're working with NDPBs as opposed to what are autonomous bodies in the context of universities, as to how that can be managed. Ultimately, it is for the boards of governors of each college to agree how they're going to address whatever cut is passed on to them. But I do believe that there is an emerging view within the sector that the measures we outlined briefly a few minutes ago are the way to go in that regard. Some of those will involve a loss of places, some of those will involve a loss of jobs, because some of the programmes that are going to be impacted involve staff providing those, and equally there are places that will be in jeopardy. But we're probably talking again in low four figures in that regard, if that. So I think we've done well to mitigate things as best we can, but I think it would be very wrong to give the impression that box ticks, problem solved in terms of skills. We're not there at all. And even if we got to a situation over the coming days where there's zero loss in terms of higher education places and zero loss in terms of further education, I think it's important that we're clear. A standstill in terms of our skills investment is not good enough. Not good enough in terms of the current situation, where skills are a driver of the economy in the context of a lower level of corporation tax. I mean, it's just simply not tenable. We have to be expanding our investment in skills.
Okay. In regard to the 6 million, excuse me, coming from FE, and you say from their reserves, that 6 million there's once. So in the 16-17 budget, are you going to have to raid their banks again?
And Chair, this is a dilemma that is probably faced in a whole host of areas, and whenever people often sort of say, well, sure, institutions have reserves, they can use those. This is always the constant problem that we face. Reserves can often only be used once. You have to have what is sustainable funding. I think in this case it is justified for a number of reasons. I think first of all, due to other factors, those reserves do tend to edge up every financial year, so we can be strategic in terms of how we're using some of it and justify dipping into some of it. Secondly, I think there's a need for the FE sector to readjust itself to what may well be some more difficult times coming along, and if we create more of a breathing space up front, that gives them a bit more time and freedom to plan for the future, rather than actually lumping in even more challenging cuts up front in 1 year and then having very little options as to how to manage that and creating, in effect, chaos in the system.
I think, Chair, if I can just add to that point, as you're aware, the Minister has embarked on a major strategy review for the further education sector, and that will give the opportunity to look to see where the sector should be positioning itself in the future, taking account of what may be coming down the track at us in future years.
Yeah. And obviously in that regard, I mean, the new apprenticeship strategy and the forthcoming youth training system create fresh opportunities for the further education sector, and obviously we're very keen to receive bids from FE colleges in relation to some higher level pilots and apprenticeships.
Yep. Derek, and you've mentioned strategies there. What's the possibility of those two coming in at the same time? Is that strategy been consulted on, agreed on, and actually started to be rolled out in regard to the cuts that are also forthcoming?
The decisions on the 15-16 budget, as the Minister has explained, will have to be taken very, very soon. So they will predate the process of developing a new strategy for the further education sector. But the point I was trying to make was that that strategy development process and implementation process will be looking ahead beyond the 15-16 year into 16-17 and what might be coming down the track, and will provide a context within which any strategic readjustment within the sector needs to take place to take account of the new circumstances.
Okay. Tom Buchanan, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, it was just to focus in on the same thing on FE and HE, and while you have moved to mitigate what was already there's still concerns, and that front line is going to be cut. But what plans does the department have to work with the colleges and the universities to look at more innovative ways forward that could drive out maybe efficiencies or provide training maybe or teaching in a different type of way that would be maybe more efficient and help in the situation that we find ourselves in?
Okay. Well, first of all, in terms of further education, it's worth highlighting shared services. We're very keen to see what potential is there for the 6 colleges to work collaboratively around a number of different areas. Now, we had some bids in relation to the Change Fund. These ones, unfortunately, weren't met. We can't win them all. But we are nevertheless committed to pursuing that. So that's about, in terms of current cost patterns, how things can be done somewhat differently. There's also the opportunity for the colleges, again, to rebalance their own offer, and we're keen that they become the key drivers in relation to the apprenticeship and youth training systems as they emerge, and additional funding packages are there for them to tap into. So that's an opportunity in that regard. In terms of higher education itself, again, making reference to apprenticeships, I'm keen to see us experiment with almost like an apprenticeship hybrid degree system, where there's a lot more focus upon in-work experience and potentially people being employed while they're doing a degree. That may be a slightly different concept from the pre-existing part-time degree approach, where there's a much more, in this occasion, there'll be a much more formalised arrangement between the employer and the higher education provider. Some initial discussions ongoing with some companies around some pilots in that area, and I know both universities are mindful of that type of opportunity. So that provides us with perhaps a more cost-effective way of preserving places, and in doing so we're also having a much keener focus around employability skills, which employers are very keen to stress that they need, as well as people with the right technical and academic skills.
And could I just pitch in just one final point? There's some really, really good thinking and work going on in some of the colleges regarding the use of new technology in teaching and learning, very innovative work, and we need to explore opportunities for rolling that out right across the sector, and not doing it 6 different ways, but doing it the best way. And I think there are opportunities not only for efficiency but greater effectiveness there. We would also be up for exploring with the colleges, and I've had meetings with all of the college principals recently, seeing whether they've all got non-departmental public body status, and that kind of straitjackets them in certain ways, but in terms of their ability to generate income as a consequence of their closer relationship with business and commerce, seeing whether there's any way we can release those shackles. Now, that involves engagement with the DFP, but I'm up for exploring opportunities there to allow the colleges to generate income if they can, but that's one for the future.
Yeah, I think that's one of the way forward. But has there been any thought given to the situation where companies and employers who are keen to get students trained up to the level and the expertise that they want them at, that if there's a work with the college and the unis, that they'd be willing perhaps to contribute something toward that and put an income in?
Yes.
Knowing that at the end of it they're going to get what they're needing and looking for to drive their business forward.
Absolutely. If we join together the apprenticeship and youth training systems with current provision, we're bringing a lot more to the table in terms of an employer contribution. So the cost to the state in terms of training should diminish by a not inconsiderable amount. So in effect, you would have a situation where if someone's doing an apprenticeship, they are employed by the company, so they're earning a wage and salary from them, while the state meets either the full or partial off-the-job training costs, whether that's through a private sector provider, an FE college or a university.
And I think we'd really want to see that kind of thinking coming through strongly in the development of the new further education strategy. And, you know, one of the 6 themes that's identified in our early thinking on the strategy, and that'll be going out for consultation in due course, is economic development, and that's in its widest sense. It's that engagement with business and partnership and pooling resources to deliver outcomes. So, I mean, it's in line with our own thinking.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Sydney?
I think you just... You touched on, Minister, on harmonising fees. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on harmonising? What is the difference in fees, and who would be the losers and gainers if you're trying to harmonise these fees, or what effect? I think you talked about £0.3 million there, did you?
Yeah, I think hopefully we'll all be winners in this regard. At present, the fee for universities is a minimum of about just under 3.8. In terms of the situation, colleges have the ability to charge up to that if they so wish. However, the maximum fee level that's currently charged by a college is £2,500, and that is the situation with both Belfast Met and CERC. The other 4 colleges are charging fees in the region of £1,500. Of course, these can be met through tuition fee loans as such, so they're not upfront costs as such, and so we believe that given that is already the practice in 2 of the 6 colleges, that there's no reason why the other 4 don't follow suit, and I think that's a fairly logical move to take ahead of actually more challenging situations which actually involve the direct cut of services. So I think that's probably one of the first things that I would be advocating the colleges to do. I think it makes a lot of sense, and this does not threaten in any way, shape or form people's access to higher education in terms of the FE setting, where it is still significantly less expensive than is the situation in higher education. It's probably about 2/3 of the cost. If my rudimentary maths are correct, Stephen.
Can you see those harmonisation taking place, and if not, would it affect then, it would impact on the colleges themselves that they would have to find the money?
Well, if that didn't proceed, that would leave a gap that would have to be found elsewhere within the FE system. So there's real interest in that happening. But having spoken to the colleges, I think they understand that that's a fairly logical step to be taking.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Anna?
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you mentioned about FE having the possibility of using their 6 million end-of-year surplus. And this is 6 million is for the sector. So what about the individual colleges? Is it going to be spread out evenly between all the 6 colleges?
We're not in a position today, Anna, to give the detailed breakdown as to how the cut will work out across the different colleges. That was a separate piece of work. We're approaching this at this stage from the point of view of balancing the department's budget for the forthcoming year. And it is our judgment that we at this stage that we have to take 12 million from the FE budget, and that we are suggesting that we would use 6 million in terms of end-year flexibility. The principals of the college are aware of the approach in that regard, and they are content that we would use that amount of EYF, or seek to use that amount of EYF during the forthcoming financial year. And as I said to the Chair, I mean, it is a delicate judgment call in terms of what is the appropriate level, in terms of dipping into a reserve position versus keeping that for future mitigation of what may happen during the rest of the decade. But obviously across 6 colleges, I mean, you're looking at an impact either side of £1 million, depending upon which particular college you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, Minister, you are, doing, I think, trying your best with given the extent of the scale of the cuts, doing your best in trying to resolve the situation. You mentioned about Belfast Metropolitan College. Can I ask this one? Yeah. The ESOL programme, they have a massive ESOL programme. How much cut are you talking about in that?
It's a saving of about 0.2 million, and it essentially involves a standardisation of approach between Belfast Met and the other 5 colleges. So it is something that we're just ironing out a discrepancy in the system. And we're also mindful that of treating a situation where we're funding ESOL more generously than other type of courses, or taking a different approach to cost recovery at ESOL than other courses, and that's what we're doing. I mean, it is an adjustment on the margins, but there's an ongoing commitment from the department and the colleges to that. And I mean, it's particularly a very important issue in South West College, for example, given the demographics in that area.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Those are all
Anna,
measures you
Anna,
suggest.
We'll come back.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Pat.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Minister. I'm sure you can only play the cards that have been dealt with here, so it's a tough budget, even though we've been critical of some areas of it. I'm trying to focus on, because it's something that this committee has been clearly working on, and that was the NEET strategy and the NEET inquiry. Are you concerned now with the impact it possibly will have on the delivering of the strategy, affecting those most marginalised? When I look, for example, at my own constituency, and the YES programme will close, there'll be nothing in my constituency, and probably other constituencies, in terms of 18 to 24-year-olds, in terms of training, involving the colleges who are making a huge impact on getting people back to work. Are you concerned that you'll no longer be able to deliver that NEET strategy?
Well, Pat, it is a source of concern, because we're moving from a situation where we had a considerable budget that we were able to invest, both in terms of the Pathways to Success strategy and the Youth Employment Scheme. And those were obviously time-limited investments from the Executive that expired on the 31st of March this year. And to be fair to the Executive, I mean, that was the understanding. We knew that. Of course, if circumstances had been different, we would have been hopeful that those investments would have been renewed, though that's not a viable option, given the pressures that the Executive is facing. We're not discontinuing YES as such, but we're trying to profile what we do around Youth Employment Scheme and mainstream that within our existing employment service offer. We are in discussions with our officials in that regard as to how best we can take forward elements of the youth employment scheme beyond the 31st of March. So we're not walking away from that. We do recognise the importance of a tailored approach to addressing youth unemployment itself. The same applies in relation to the NEETS strategy. I'm not sure if you missed my opening comments where we said that we accepted the pressure in relation to the Community Family Support Programme. So we're trying to ensure we can maintain and integrate safe continuity with that, because we believe it's, in terms of addressing prevention of people becoming NEETS, that's been a very effective way of doing that. Again, we're looking to see how we can deliver what we have previously been doing in relation to NEETS through use of the European Social Fund. And you'll understand we have a bigger pool of money for the European Social Fund than was the case previously. We're losing, for example, the Collaboration and Innovation Fund under the Pathway strategy because the funding again has dried up. But we're hopeful that a number of the organisations who were delivering as part of that fund will have bid in relation to the European Social Fund, and I can't predict who will be successful otherwise at this stage, but we may well see some projects continuing or being revamped in that regard. I think on the European Social Fund, I think it's probably worth saying that at this stage we need to be very mindful that there's a huge problem in the system around the securing of match funding. Now, we can proceed to award grants or give people recognise who's been successful in terms of bids under the European Social Fund. People don't need to have their match funding in place from day one. But there's been a requirement for people to get money from other statutory organisations outside the context of DEL itself. And all our departments, councils are all facing up to what are quite serious difficulties in terms of access and resources, and sometimes that type of support beyond their own core services is often the first thing they look to in terms of making efficiencies. So there's going to be an ongoing dilemma in terms of how we can maximise European Social Fund match funding, which is why as a department we're trying to do what we can internally to provide some backup in that regard, but again our capacity in that regard is limited too.
And I'm going to adhere to the Chair's one question.
Many parts, sub-clauses, no doubt.
Clearly there is worry and concern and distress amongst the community sector in relation to the European Social Fund, and I would appeal to your department to try and accelerate that process. In every darkest hour there's always opportunities as well, and the Change Fund, Minister, is there opportunities, for example, on economic inactivity on the pilot programmes that we talked about that might help in constituencies where there is historical long-term unemployment or economic inactivity?
Well, you will note that there was a successful bid in the Change Fund which came through from our colleagues in social development, and that may well be of relevance in terms of taking forward some initial work in relation to economic inactivity. We had made our own bid as a department for some initial resources in relation to economic inactivity of about 0.6 million. That again was unsuccessful. We probably, while we were very successful in our bids, there was still some that weren't met. Now, I've said to our officials that we are going to proceed with the finalisation of the strategy. Hopefully we will get that to the Executive before the end of February, so it should be agreed and in place by the beginning of the next financial year. And we will look to making a bid in monitoring rounds in relation to what is a relatively small amount of money to get the ball rolling in 15-16 in relation to the strategy, and then look to see what we can do in the 16-20 budget around long-term funding for the strategy. So at this stage, while the funding is not in place for economic inactivity, the amount of money we need is relatively small for 15-16. That's outside the context of that DSD bid, and so we're hopeful that we can proceed with the strategy. And with particular reference to what I'm sure you're about to ask me about Derry as a pilot area, I mean, we are mindful of running some controlled pilots And the most logical thing a government does is actually pilot things in the areas that are problem is most acute. So read between the lines on that one.
There you go, Pat. You didn't need the question, but you got the answer. Bronwyn.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. Minister, did you make any bids during the negotiations at Christmas? You know, did you, for example, highlight the additional pressures faced by your department in, for example, funding the special premium for St Mary's College and Stranmillis College University? Did you highlight those additional pressures during those negotiations that your department faces?
Well, first of all, at a general level, we were extremely clear throughout the month of December and beforehand in relation to the impact of the draft budget on our budget. I don't think anyone could have missed what was said directly by myself, nor indeed what was said by universities and colleges, or what was said by the business community in relation to the budget. So things were very clear. Now, bids, the process between draft budget and final budget doesn't relate to bids being made as such. I mean, there was a consultation process. DFP then make a final recommendation to the executive, which in practice is hammered out between the DEP and Sinn Féin in practical terms. I voted against the budget, which is a matter of public record, for a host of reasons. Not just that I didn't think that the skills issue had been sufficiently addressed, but you seem to be suggesting that I should have been making a specific bid for the money for the premia, which we did actually highlight as a potential saving in our draft budget, which we published at the beginning of December. But to my mind, I don't see the logic as to why we would be bidding for that. My ultimate objective is to do what we can to protect the economy and protect services for those who are most vulnerable. So I want to maximise the deployment of resources in those areas, as opposed to investing in subsidies that are based around institutions rather than investing in people. And so our case was made about getting as best a settlement that we could for the department as a whole to allow us to protect the frontline services that are being provided by the department. So in any situation, I should, by logic, be prioritising the front line ahead of what are, in effect, subsidies. Because in terms of the approach I was taking, where I see unnecessary subsidies or dead weight in the system, those are areas that I want to address to ensure we are maximising our resources. And one of the messages that was given very clearly in the debate yesterday in the Assembly to me was to use my money wisely, which is what I'm seeking to do. What you're suggesting is the opposite of using it wisely.
I would disagree with you, Minister, and I'm sure you're well aware of the difficulties faced by the Department of Education as well, and it was made clear there publicly, just like yourself, but they made the bids and they secured, you know, substantial funding. And again, I just said, for example, to highlight the additional pressures on your department, you know, through funding that special premium. You know, it doesn't mean to say that it's related to that, but it's just everything in general.
Yeah. I heard it said by someone in relation to the teacher training debate that somehow I had said nothing in relation to the budget over the preceding 6 to 8 weeks, and that Sinn Féin were doing all the heavy lifting in relation to the DEL budget. I really struggle to find any evidence, publicly or privately, of that type of endeavour having taken place at all. And while you make reference to the Department of Education, I think it's worth referencing that they're part of what I would term a racket that's going on in relation to teacher training, where the fundamental objective of some seems to be based around protecting institutions rather than doing what's best for the teaching profession and investing in students. We have an ongoing situation which predates this mandate, but it's carried on into this mandate, where we have a professionally statistically based teacher demand model, which indicates what is the demand level for teachers within our economy and what we should be investing in. That model has been traditionally topped up for political reasons by Sinn Féin ministers with a view, quite explicit view, to maintain the viability of the teacher training colleges. So whether we're talking about a premia, whether we're talking about artificial numbers of teachers being trained whenever we know there's not the jobs for them, we seem to have an agenda of actually propping up a system that is fragmented, costly, reinforcing division in society, not actually addressing the best academic standards compared to what's happening internationally, all to protect institutions rather than actually doing the best in terms of student teachers and also future pupils. And that comes at an opportunity cost and a price that prevents us investing in frontline services. So whenever people come to me and talk about what are you doing to protect the vulnerable, what are you doing to protect the economy, I'll say, well, actually, I'm not doing all that I can because other people's agendas are saying, actually, spend money in an inefficient manner, resisting change that's happening elsewhere in the world.
Is that an objective point of view, Minister?
Well, we've had a report from Grant Thornton into the financing of our teacher education system. We've had a report from international experts. And I stress the word independent. I didn't tell them what to write. And any suggestions that they wrote something that wasn't independent, I think they would take great issue with. It says that our current system is not sustainable and that we are not reaching our full potential in line with international standards. So that would be a view that would be held beyond me, beyond my own political party. We've had similar reforms in Glasgow and Dublin, very close to home. They were nothing to do with me. I didn't force those reforms to happen. But they, in those societies, had the good sense to address change in their societies for the better, and actually to protect and to ensure that they are addressing the needs of their own diverse pluralist school systems that exist in their own societies.
I'll come back, Bronwyn. David?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister, for your attendance today. And I do acknowledge the heavy lifting that you've had to do in recent days. I don't envy it at all. The idea that places may be lost at university and higher education level will then have a knock-on effect and put potentially the further education and colleges under pressure, which then may affect, as you mentioned, probably they're the more vulnerable in our community. How do you see that panning out, and how could that be mitigated in any way?
Well, the difficult answer there is that there probably isn't a real mitigation in that regard. I mean, I think I was asked previously, I mean, what plan B do you have in terms of the cutbacks? I mean, the plan B is to do what we can in terms of funding plan A, but whenever we don't have the resources for plan A, then we're going to have difficulties. You're right to suggest that there will be a knock-on effect, that people may be looking elsewhere for provision, which in turn displaces others. We could see a situation where more people end up studying outside of Northern Ireland, and with the risk that they never return. That's a wasted resource. There's also people who may never get the opportunity to study at all and stay outside the education and training system, not living up to their full economic potential. That may become a pressure in terms of social security budgets, or they may be in jobs paying or jobs for which they maybe maybe they're overqualified or overskilled in the sense that they could be performing at a higher level. So again, we're not tapping into people's full potential in that regard. So yes, there's a very real consequence in this regard. We are potentially moving backwards in terms of higher education at a time where we should be moving forwards. I mean, we have calls for the expansion of McGee to be taking place, something I want to see happening. But the reality is, rather than actually growing our higher education sector in line with what people rightly are aspiring to see happening, potentially we're seeing a contraction. The situation in FE is actually quite fundamental, and I think the report that we're very clear in this regard. Further education has always prided itself as being open to all. And I'm told, I'm hopefully still relatively young, but for those who are slightly older and wiser than me in many respects, tell me that throughout their lifetime, FE has always been open and accessible. This is now potentially the first time in their memory that we are going to be rationing access to further education. So that's an enormous statement that we're potentially making at this stage.
Okay, thank you. And potentially more a question to Derek in relation to, you did mention you had spoken to the heads of each of the colleges in recent days. A lot of the hard decisions to be taken down the line at the moment. How can that be managed? And I know some of the people who sit on boards and they're not looking forward to the time ahead, and maybe someone don't have the experience potentially. Is there any support or backup for as we move forward for those boards?
Yeah, I think the Minister alluded to this point. I think there is a great degree of collegiality amongst the further education colleges. There are 6 organisations, and I suppose we are fortunate as a sector. We can all get together in the same room with the principals, with the chairs of the governing bodies, and there is fantastic cooperation between them. The Minister has already listed the mitigating actions which the colleges generally have identified, and that is they coming up with their ideas in conjunction with ourselves. We work really closely with them, and we will continue to do so. It's probably, non-departmental public body status is a double-edged sword for the colleges. I appreciate that, and it does things to them which they'd probably not rather have done to them, but at the same time it brings them into the fold, and we work really well together. So this is not a one-off process. We'll be working with them right throughout the year. And Minister mentioned that unfortunately we had a change fund bid for exploring shared services turned down, but that isn't the end of that work. We'll be working with them to see where we can go with that. And as I said earlier too, I think the development of a new strategy gives us a great opportunity to introduce new thinking. So, I mean, it's a really difficult time for the colleges, but it's also an exciting time too.
Okay. Bill?
Thanks, and Minister, thanks for coming. I'm sure you're devastated that I couldn't participate in yesterday's debate.
I'm shocked.
I know.
And
I need to declare an interest as a student of the Ulster University at this stage.
Double jobbing.
If I've got any more jobs, I'd take them too. I'm also a class rep, I'll have you know. Can I ask you what input you have into how universities spend money? The decision by Queen's to cut the budget for the Student Union has concerned me, given the fact that they've seemed to have made no efforts to tackle the excessive salaries of those at the top of the institution. And I certainly think that cuts of that nature should be directed towards people that are earning $250,000 a year, as opposed to cutting jobs for 7 people that provide a very valuable service for students.
Well, can I say this at the outset, Phil? I mean, if we follow through with what your party's advocating me to do, there'll be even less money for the universities, so there'll be even more difficulty in terms of situations facing students in terms of services. I have met with the Students' Union representatives as part of my own engagement with stakeholders, and I'm sympathetic to the point that they're making in relation to having the proper resources. And the Students' Unions aren't just about the social aspect, they are providing a very strong welfare aspect, which is incredibly important, particularly in these very difficult, austere times that we're living through. It is ultimately for the universities themselves to manage their budgets. I can certainly advise and use my influence in that regard, and certainly pass on the direction of travel that you're advocating. But I do want to make clear in relation to the issue of salaries. First of all, those are not something that are approved by the department, nor is our advice sought in that regard. Furthermore, I'm not here to justify the salaries that are sometimes paid within the higher education sector. However, it is important to bear in mind that we are not just looking at those salaries in the context of the Northern Ireland economy. We're looking at those in terms of the context of what is a market in higher education across these islands, across Europe, across the world. And if we want to have what are world-class universities in Northern Ireland, we need to be part of that process where we are attracting what is internationally mobile, high-calibre academic talent. That is just part and parcel of what we're trying to achieve. So if we're wanting to go out to the rest of the world and use our universities and colleges as a means of attracting inward investment, we have to have some substance behind that. We can't go out to the world and say, come invest in Northern Ireland. We have 2 of the best universities in the world. We have the best quality in terms of students coming through. We're doing the best research. We've very quickly found out if that's not the case. So we have to make sure that we're making all of the proper investments in higher education, and also ensuring that they have the freedom to make what are the best decisions in light of what is an international market in higher education.
I note you're not going to defend it, but then you kind of did in a qualified manner.
I'm not defending, I'm rationalising it.
I hear what you're saying, and I can understand why the university would defend it, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with it here.
Or am I? I'm rationalising.
So in terms of potential revenue that universities can attract, has any work or assessment been made of the positive impact in revenue terms that increased student flows from across the border could have on our universities? If more students from the south were able to come to universities in the north, or could be attracted into them as a result of the fact that they're not included in the cap on student numbers that apply?
Well, the first thing to say in terms of revenue raising for the universities, that if you ask them the question what they would like to explore, just be conscious they will come back with the first answer being an increase in tuition fees, and you'll be conscious of the current.
That's a matter for us, not them.
That's a matter, indeed, but they're entitled to come back and actually make that point to you. So what you're suggesting in terms of revenue raising are measures on the margins of what they would view as being the main instrument available to them to increase the revenues. Just to put that in context.
Well, I think we just tell them now that increase in tuition fees isn't available for them. So
that's perfectly fine, and that's not a position that I disagree with. But just putting you in context that if you want to ask them about revenue raising, that's what they're going to say. So anything else is of marginal benefit in terms of revenue raising. They're all of worth, but just to put it in its fullest context. There's probably two ways that are worthy of discussion. One is attracting more and more international students outside the European Union, and then also students from within the context of the European Union. Students, obviously, from elsewhere in the island are treated the same as students domestically in any event. So the gain from that is probably fairly limited. It's probably more lucrative to get students from elsewhere within the UK because while we're not able to discriminate against nationals from other EU countries, we can have different regimes for students from different parts of the UK. So we are very keen to develop that. Shall we say, it's still a work in progress, and some of the events over the past number of years maybe haven't allowed us to expand the level of recruitment from elsewhere in these islands to the extent that we would have preferred. It's also worth noting as well that our universities are performing well in advance of their size relative to the UK as a whole in terms of engagement with the community and business sectors, which also is a way of generating additional revenue. So it's important that we put that on record. That's a real success story that's coming through the higher education sector. That type of endeavour can grow ever further, but what will be generated from that, you're talking in the best case scenario, single figure millions of additional revenue. And of itself, that's not going to address what is a major structural problem within higher education. I think it's worth putting on record, even before you hit the current budget cuts that we're having to pass on to universities, we are in a situation where the funding per place is lower than the average in GB, by between 1,000 and 2,500, depending upon the funding band that we're talking about. So there's a real pressure in terms of quality there that we are going to struggle to preserve over the coming years. So the status quo in terms of higher education funding is probably no longer tenable. We are going to have some discussions as to how we address that. It's clear in England they have gone one way in terms of higher level fees. You very clearly said that that's not something you're prepared to contemplate, which is fine. But also bear in mind that then Scotland have gone a different route where they have invested much more in terms of direct revenue into the university sector. We have tended to fall between those two stools in Northern Ireland. I think we have to make a decision to follow one or other path. By implication, you're suggesting we go for the latter path, but I think we need to have a bigger discussion with the Executive and other members of the Assembly over how we approach next year's budget in that regard then.
Okay. Minister, back to your paper, 4.1 million for their departmental efficiencies and reductions. Talk us through those again.
Well, some of those, probably three different categories. I'll let my colleagues come in with some more of the detail in a minute, just to put them on standby. Some of those will be around demand. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. Demand for EMA is falling just through demographics, so some savings can be found in that regard. We anticipate that there will be a fall in demand in relation to the current apprenticeship NI scheme, in part because we're seeing some migration towards our new pilot interventions. So again, we can possibly make some savings there. We're going to ask the tribunals to save 0.3 million, and the balance then will be for the department to find further savings. I think it's worth stressing, and probably Derek can kick off in this regard, we are perhaps being fairly conservative in terms of what we expect to generate in terms of savings from staff reductions. I know this is something that's very much in the press at the moment, and there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how that can be bottomed out. I think, given the nature of this and from experiences elsewhere, it is unlikely that we're going to find the level of savings that some departments and others seem to be factoring in. So we have taken perhaps a more cautious approach in that regard. So what we have settled on is trying to find a balance of savings of probably an additional 2.3 million across the department as a whole. Some of that may well be in terms of if we can push the envelope in terms of the staff savings. Others may well be from other departmental efficiencies.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, I can just expand on that point. I think I mentioned it last time. We will participate fully in the Civil Service Voluntary Exit Scheme, and we have set ourselves what I think is a pretty ambitious target of reducing our pay bill by 10%. We would not achieve 10% in 1 year, because the Civil Service Scheme, if it goes according to the timetable which has been indicatively mapped out by the Department of Finance and Personnel, will probably open for interest at the start of March, but by the time you would actually get staff out, you'd be well through the financial year, so you'd only maybe get half of a year's benefit of the full year savings. But nevertheless, we're going to go for that. None of us knows what the level of interest will be, the proposed terms of the voluntary exit scheme. There could be a stampede or there could be a trickle, and we're really taking it on trust. So we're taking a punt there. But the Minister has outlined some elements of the 4.1 million. Other elements of that are just, we have a fairly significant overtime bill in the department. Now, that isn't unnecessary overtime. It's about £500,000 a year or just over. We're just going to say, no, we're going to stop that, you know, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. We're having to be brutal here. We're doing what might be regarded by the committee as silly things, shutting buildings a bit earlier than they normally close, because if they stay open that wee bit longer, we have to pay security guards overtime to, you know, go around, do a check of the building and shut it down. That saves a little bit on heat and other services. So it's all kinds of little measures like that, cutting and paring back wherever we can. And some of it we're taking in trust that just as the year goes on, we'll be cutting back on travel, on subsistence, on going to London to meetings or whatever, to identify savings whenever and wherever we can.
I could just say as well, Eric, just in terms of looking at the detail, the devil's in the detail of all this. We're going through with each individual cost centre, HR and finance, looking at every single job and seeing if is that absolutely essential or is there a different way of doing that. So we're down in the granular detail of that, going through each individual cost centre, and as Derek says, 10% is well above the 6.4% sort of net reduction that we have to find, and it equates to sort of broadly 200 members of staff out of 2,000.
Okay, can I just maybe picking up on that, Stephen, if you're looking now through every cost centre, every individual job, my understanding was it was to be a voluntary redundancy scheme. If you are now going through every job, and I think your words were to see if it was necessary, is that moving away from the voluntary nature of the scheme to more, you're actually looking at positions that can be removed?
There's a difference between posts and people.
Yeah.
You can suppress a post, but the person then has to be redeployed. The person is not made redundant. The post is closed down, and you find an alternative post for the individual.
And do you think, Derek, across the department, there's enough variation across all grades that'll make this attractive within the department that you'll reach your numbers?
I honestly don't know. Are you talking about attractive in terms of the voluntary exit scheme? Yeah. I honestly don't know. I mean, I have a personal view on this. I mean, members of the committee may be aware that 2 years ago there was an exceptionally generous severance scheme in the civil service, and that was changed a couple of years ago. It is not as attractive anymore, and I think an individual would need to be in fairly particular circumstances, financially and personally, for this to be deemed attractive to them. Now, there may be enough people in the civil service who will find this attractive. I just don't know. I think, you know, I talk to my colleagues in what's called corporate HR in the Department of Finance and Personnel, which does HR policy and strategy for the whole civil service. And they have some concerns that maybe the scheme will not be sufficiently attractive. to attract all of the numbers that departments are anticipating in year one. So and bear in mind that the Stormont House Agreement created a public sector transformation fund to fund voluntary severances over a 4-year period. So it may be that this would be repeated year on year on year till we get to the point that we need to get to. We are shooting in the dark in this. I fully accept that.
Go ahead.
No.
What was that?
That's that. We're shooting in the dark, Chair.
Full stop.
Full stop. You know, it's crystal ball time. It really is. Where were you talking about a voluntary redundancy? Or sorry, it's not redundancy, it's exit scheme. There's a difference.
We heard that too, Chair, in the Committee for the Environment, the same thing.
Is that? No.
Yeah.
Maybe,
So
Chair,
you've
can I-
done no internal work in regard to what numbers you may be looking at?
No, you can't do that in advance. I mean, we can't go around and say, would you be interested? Because the terms of the scheme have not actually been formally decided by the executive yet.
Hopefully this week.
Okay.
But you're right, Chair, to just say in terms of the challenge that we'll be faced with, because there will be people wanting to go onto the voluntary exit scheme. There will be the posts that Derek has mentioned that will go. So it's marrying the two, is going to be a challenge for us, and it will involve moving people around to fill posts, because the two won't marry up.
Yeah, and I've said this before. This, in my view, as a manager, is a massive risk to business continuity, to the whole civil service over the course of the next year, 18 months. The churn that will be in the system caused by a massive voluntary exit scheme, not just regarding those who leave, but those who remain and have to be moved around jobs. You ally that to departmental reorganisation, which will affect Dell. You ally that to very significant budget cuts, which places pressures on the ability to deliver programmes, and you've kind of got a perfect storm of internal issues which make business continuity difficult. Now, those are management issues, and that's for me as opposed to the Minister, but it's going to be a really difficult time for not just Dell, but every department.
Yep. Sorry, just a quick one to finish. The two don't marry up, Derek. If the two don't marry up and you have to and you've done your assessment on posts being redundant, are we then looking at redundancies within the department rather than voluntary exit?
No, ministers have made it very, very clear that there is no prospect of anything other than voluntary exits, and that would mean we would have to carry the cost of staff and we would have to revisit our budget yet again.
So you would carry staff doing nothing then if you made the post redundant?
Well, they won't be doing nothing, but we will not be able to deliver the quantum of pay bill all of our staff are doing something. They're doing a lot. These pay bill reductions will be hugely painful. To decimate an organisation, literally take 1 in 10 out, is going to seriously impair our capability and our capacity. But if we cannot get rid of sufficient numbers of staff through voluntary exit, well, then they stay. And we will not generate savings through that mechanism. And in year, we're going to have to recalibrate and look again. And I think that is a point I would make. All of this will require the most minute management and monitoring week by week, month by month, because things will change and assumptions that we make about savings may not materialise. Maybe we've underestimated, maybe we've overestimated, but it's only a plan.
Okay. Tom? Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you. With relation to the 1.8 million pressures relating to the match funding for European Social Fund, what impact is that going to have on attracting monies from the ESF in the future?
The problem is that if we can't attract the match funding, then we can't draw down the full programme. So the risk is that we're unable to maximise the programme and that we also fail to meet targets. So it's a difficult situation to be in, and certainly for match funding we will be bidding in in-year monitoring rounds to ensure that we can maximise the use of the funds and not lose monies to the Northern Ireland bloc.
Yeah, and what impact is this going to have on the community family support programme?
Well, again, we have provided for the amount of match funding required for that within that 1.8. So that's secured for that year. It's other match funding areas that we are particularly looking for additional funding.
Yeah, I should add that 1.9 million or 1.8 million pressure in the draft budget, which the Minister has outlined, we've made provision for that within the context of balancing our books, so we have that.
To be honest, the bigger pressure is probably other departments not being able to meet match funding. That's a real risk for us.
Okay, Minister, just one further question for you. See, by restructuring and refining the teacher training into a single, for instance, a single training college or two, whatever it would be, but to restructure that, not only the 2.2 premium that you're looking at, how much more would the department, or would you expect you would save by doing that? Because not only is there a financial implication to it, but at the moment there's a perception, a wrong perception given, where we're training teachers for jobs that there are no jobs for, in excess of some 200 teachers per year. So therefore what we're doing is we're saying to the young people, even through the career service, you should go for a teacher, when reality is there's no job for them at the end of it. So what you see would be the real savings in real terms here if this was to be brought into a single college?
Well, first of all, it's important to bear in mind that there's a range of different options for any potential reconfiguration of the system, and depending upon which option finds agreement, of course, if any find agreement, they will have different degrees of savings, and obviously going for a single provider. And in the context of a single provider, it's always important to stress that we're not talking here about integration, we're talking about a shared inclusive means to deliver for all of the different school sectors that exist in Northern Ireland. We're training teachers side by side in that regard. But that type of model will be the most financially efficient. Other models will have lesser degrees of efficiency. But obviously we wouldn't be proposing to continue to pay the premium, which would be a degree of efficiency. Hopefully our colleagues in the Department of Education would have the freedom to set a more realistic target in terms of the teachers to be trained, because there wouldn't be the same requirement in their view to look to the viability or the continued viability of certain providers. The current non-ITE provision that exists in terms of the university colleges may well be consolidated into some other provision. Again, there will be some savings in that regard. Even if we went tomorrow for an option, it would probably take about 4 years for the full savings to be generated, because you're having to honour everything that's already in the system in terms of any degree people have started. We always honour that. That's a fundamental principle that we've adhered to throughout the years. So even something that's agreed tomorrow for entry in September, it would probably take 4 years before the full effects would be viewed. But there's three different angles from which you would find considerable savings alongside the more administrative savings that you would also find. Can we put a figure on that, Heather? Probably about 4 or 5 million potentially.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Anna?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. NICFA came before us, Minister, with concerns about the cuts, about the funding to the sector. What impact is it going to have on them now with this new budget?
NICFA?
NICFA came before the committee.
We met with NICFA to discuss all of the issues that they raised with the committee. We systematically worked through their issues and found, I think, in everyone a way of addressing or mitigating those as they set them out. At this stage, the community voluntary sector themselves, who depend to an extent upon the European Social Fund bids, are waiting to hear the outcome of that process. I think we've about between 130 and 140 bids in total were received, and the consideration of those is already at a fairly advanced stage, and so allocations can be made, but their ability to get much funding is probably going to be the biggest impediment they're going to face in terms of actually actively drawing down money from the fund. We'll do our best to seek to source that for groups, but if other organisations themselves are losing funding, this is going to be
include youth facing big cuts. So are they going to continue to see that cuts materialise?
Well, I can't comment on whether I include youth. I don't know the full list. I haven't asked that because it's not appropriate. I don't want to. It has to be an objective process, so it's best I don't see the list until it comes to me with formal recommendations from officials. So even if include youth are have bid, I'm not sure how their bid has been assessed to date, but we will see in due course.
Okay.
Pat?
Yeah. I was keen, Derek, when you talked about when the chair was quizzing you on the human resources and possible redundancies, and you used the phrase you wouldn't want an organisation or to decimate an organisation in that context. And reflecting on the decisions made on St Mary's and Stranmillis, was there any? Did you reflect on the decimation that would take place there in the same context with over 30% reduction? And what impact or what quality proofing took place in terms of the impact on the social, community and economic value in South and West Belfast?
First of all, I didn't say I wouldn't want to decimate the organisation. I'm making the point that we will be decimating the organisation, taking 1 in 10 staff out of the organisation. That's the effect of what we're planning to do with a 10% pay bill reduction in the department. So far as the decisions on the premia for the initial teacher education institutions are concerned, I think the Minister has adequately explained all of the thinking behind that, and I don't think I have anything to add to that at all.
But the question was, you would accept that 2 organisations, St Mary's and Stranmillis, would be decimated by this impact?
We've never accepted that, and further to that, it's important to bear in mind that what is a potential decision in relation to the premia has to be balanced against the fact that there is a clear course of action that can mitigate the effect of that, which is a range of different models for the reconfiguration of teacher education in Northern Ireland, which we know is not sustainable, and we have known it's not sustainable for the best part of a decade or longer. So there are ways in which we can ensure that we are continuing to provide teacher education and to ensure we're actually meeting the level of demand we require within our economy. So there's a means by which we can address the impact of the loss of premia by reforming the system.
Just to finish off, and I listened intently to your final comments, Minister, in the Chamber yesterday, reflecting on the debate and your desire to try and achieve a consensus and your willingness to enter a process. Just given the concerns of most of the political parties in the Chamber and the House on the subject matter pertaining to Stranmillis and St Mary's, would you be mindful of bringing in somebody independent to bring those players into one room to try and get some consensus? And if you did get consensus in one of the options on the independent panel, would that allow you to remove the exclusion of the premia to the colleges?
Well, first of all, we have made a commitment to all of the providers to reflect on what is the next step in the way forward, including how best to engage with all of them in terms of a roundtable format. Secondly, we have said that in the event that we can find consensus, that we are willing to consider that, subject to meeting a number of basic benchmarks. First of all, that it is something that's clearly more financially sustainable than the current situation. Secondly, that we're meeting international trends in terms of the approach to teacher education. And thirdly, that we are making moves towards a more shared and inclusive manner in which we're training our teachers in recognition of what is wider policy in Northern Ireland towards shared education. The final point you make is about the return of the premia. And I think it's appropriate actually to turn it back to yourself, Pat. If we are not to find savings from the premia, where else do I have to take those savings in terms of my budget? I mean, you have made a very passionate case already today about the importance of the continued provision of the Youth Employment Scheme. You've expressed concern around what we do around the Pathways to Success strategy. So if we are to restore the premia, that creates further pressures right across the remainder of the department and would have very real implications for everything else that we do, including those type of services. So we've got a fixed budget here, and choices have to be made. So every penny we pay in premia has to come off some other budget allocation.
You know, if I had the hundreds of staff that you have to reflect on budgetary concerns, certainly I would be in a much stronger position and have the capacity to give that answer to you. But is there not, just given the reflection, sorry Chair, I'll finish.
Well, to be fair, the advice I'm getting from officials is that the premia is not warranted. and that there are other areas where we should be investing to protect frontline services, including for the most vulnerable. So the hundreds of civil servants are giving me advice that we do need to look to reconfigure, and we have the evidence base to justify the argument that reconfiguration is both desirable and doable in the context of Northern Ireland, but that we have very real pressures elsewhere.
But, you know, given that you clearly are stating you would reflect on discussions on the budget, given that this House made an appeal directly to you to reinstate the money on Premia, would you go now to the Executive as a result of that vote in the House yesterday to ask for the difference for the Executive to make it up?
But with respect, Pat, the House yesterday also advised me during speeches and also during what was actually the original committee motion to do what I can to protect higher education and further education. I was told to protect the economy. I was told to protect the most vulnerable in society who depend upon the opportunity that comes from training and education to actually have an opportunity to engage. I was told to use my budget wisely, and then at the same time I was told, well, restore the premium. In my head, I cannot rationalise those two messages. And that the Chair said at the start, I mean, about what I said in radio this morning, that's the context in which I made those remarks. To me, what you're asking me to do two entirely contradictory things. And the resolution that was passed yesterday, it's fine to call for me to restore the premium. But to be clear, if I was to follow the advice of the Assembly in that regard, it means taking the money from somewhere else. And I mean, if I had to take that from the NEATS budget, you'd be the first person in the Assembly to stand up and to cast aspersions on my motives for doing that and say, this is reckless, why are you doing that?
I probably would, but Minister, yeah. I asked the question to challenge the other ministers to put their money where their mouth is and go to the Executive and ask for additional money to cover the premium for the two colleges.
And the same thing applies, Pat, with going to the Executive, even leaving aside my own budget and going to the Executive. Mm-hmm. Can I sit here with good conscience and listen to what's happening in the health service, around people sitting on trolleys in the accident emergency, having to wait excessive lengths of time to get treatment? Do we look what's happening in terms of safety on our roads and streetlights and all those type of things where we're desperately needing investment? So how do I, with a good conscience, go and actually go to the Executive and say, well, give me £2 million? Because that itself has to come from somewhere else. Every single penny that is spent in Northern Ireland comes at the opportunity cost of doing something else with that money. And no one out there at this stage, anywhere in our budget, says that we have plenty of money or that there's waste somewhere else in the system that we can easily tap into. Now, I mean, don't do things like revenue raising. Your party's ruled out doing those sorts of things, which brings more money into the system. If we have a fixed budget, choices have to be made, whether it's in my own department or across the Executive as a whole. And if we get that money from the central pot, that £2 million is coming off somebody else. And what other department do I take it from?
Bronwyn? You all right? David?
Chair, thanks, and probably should have declared, obviously, I'm part of the management of the Michael Hughes Academy, who work with the Northern Regional College in conjunction with a partnership which helps the NEATS category. Sometimes it makes me smile when I hear this socio-economic argument on certain decisions, or no, not decisions, actually just an argument, to be fair, when you come from a constituent like East Antrim who's losing the whole university into Belfast with tens of thousands of students and staff all heading into Belfast. So sometimes you sort of sit back and smile at that. But anyway, it's been touched upon to a certain degree, but next year's budget, where we are, where we will be in future years, has there been any support at all, given that it's established that Dale took a really bad hit compared to other departments? Is there any executive support as we move through the next lot of months as to where potential help could come from?
Well, I think the first thing to say, and it's important not to be churlish in this regard, is to actually welcome and recognise the changes that did take place between the draft budget and the final budget. I certainly do appreciate the additional resources that were allocated. In saying that, of course, I do have to say that they're not in themselves enough to address what are the pressures around skills. And even if we manage to stretch things this year in practice just to cover the existing provision, a standstill itself is not good enough. We have to be investing in skills, even in terms of the current climate, never mind the potential for a lower level of corporation tax. But of course, if we did get that lower level of corporation tax, the pressure on skills becomes even more acute. So I think I'm certainly looking at this as a bridging year. We will see the outcome of the next comprehensive spending review whenever we have a new government in London after May, and then the Executive will have to consider what is going to be a 4-year budget. We are potentially going to be making a decision around the lower level of corporation tax, and that's going to have to be resourced by the Executive. From my own point of view, I think there's two considerations I think it's important that I communicate and put on record. I think, first of all, that we have to view a decision on a rate as part of a budget process, and to ensure that a rate that we establish is going to be sustainable. It's important that whenever we go out to the world and market Northern Ireland, that we have the credibility to stand over what we are advocating around corporate tax rates. And if we are unable to maintain that, I think our credibility will suffer enormously. So it's important that whatever we do is going to be financially sustainable. That means further tough decisions around budgets in that four-year period. I am concerned that inadvertently we end up raiding the skills budget or underinvesting in skills in order to find the money to underpin a lower level of corporation tax. A lower level of corporation tax will not be effective in isolation of further investment in skills. And if anything, the advice would be that we have to, at best, invest in skills ahead of a lower level of corporation tax, or at worst, do the two in conjunction with each other. But the notion that we go out and artificially increase demand levels within our economy for skills without the ability in terms of supply to meet that demand, I think would be very dangerous and would maybe create expectations that we cannot meet as an economy and society. So I think there's a real job of work for the Department, and hopefully in partnership with the Committee over the next 12 months, to make sure that there's a full understanding as our legacy, in effect, of the importance of skills to the economy and the need for full investment in that regard.
Chair, and that said, maybe as we move forward over the years, would a reduction in the department's place the likes of skills and higher and further education in a better place financially, budget-wise, if it was merged with a larger department?
I'm largely comfortable with the direction of travel that we're seeing in terms of the potential review of departments. It is, I think, something that's been advised for quite some time, in particular with the bringing together of the skills policy, economic policy, skills policy, alongside the key levers for delivery of skills, which will be our colleges and universities under one roof. I think that more integrated approach to the economy may position skills better in terms of future budgetary negotiations. So I think, on balance, it can only be a positive development, though I think ultimately, if the money's not there, the money's not there, so you're still facing the same basic problem around that. And I suppose, Chair, as we come to the conclusion of today's session, I imagine shortly, though I'm not shutting things down, just to be clear if there are other questions. Just to be clear, two things. First of all, we're more than happy to come back in writing with the final outworkings of decisions that we take, and indeed, if people want further evidence sessions around those in more detail, we're happy to provide those. But just as David mentions, the review of departments, it's maybe just to say to everyone that there is an issue that I think is still out for within the Executive, that's still being discussed, and I think it may be something that the Committee may want to take a view on over the coming weeks, which is where the Employment Service best sits in terms of any future institutional design. It is the desire of the Executive that the bulk of the current DEL functions merge with all of DETI's functions to create this new Department of the Economy. One issue that is somewhat left for debate is whether the Employment Service best sits within a social welfare context, where it would be working more closely hand in hand with the Social Security Agency. In effect, you're overcoming the current administrative gap between the Employment Service and the SSA, or whether the Employment Service sits better in terms of an overall economic department, in recognition that the Employment Service isn't just about the mechanics of getting people jobs, it's about an interface with skills levers to ensure that people have the ability to find and maintain a job. So that argument tends to lean in the other direction. So I think there are genuine arguments in both ways on this issue, and it may be something that the Committee itself may want to reflect upon over the coming weeks more directly.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Minister, just in closing, your draft budget as you presented on, I think it was the 4th of December, had the table of the 33.2 million savings and then a number of other headings. The only difference between that draft budget and today's budget, I think, is the final figures assigned to HEFE and further savings. What role did the consultation process play? Did it affect your mindset in any shape or form?
Well, I mean, probably those three main themes that came across from the consultation responses that we received, and of course DFP received their own general responses to the budget. In the interest of full disclosure, I mean, as you can imagine, we received a lot of correspondence in relation to the teacher training issue. I mean, that didn't surprise us in any sense. We don't, however, respond to consultations based upon the sheer quantity of responses. It's based upon the quality, and within those there was not any compelling arguments that would lead us to change the approach that we had recommended at that stage. And obviously we're still reflecting on things through until we set the final budget, hopefully later on this week. We also then, second and thirdly, got a lot of advice around the importance of the skills investment and higher education and further education. All along, the approach I've been taking is to do everything I can to find savings elsewhere in the services of the department before coming to higher education and further education. So there's always going to be a situation that after we've dealt with everything else, we would then look to the balance and how that would then be passed on to both of those sectors. And that's pretty much the process that we follow through. I concur with the vast bulk of the arguments that were made in the consultation around higher education and further education, but simply do not have the capacity to eliminate the threat that exists to provision in both of those areas. And sadly, we're in the context today that we have to make some allocations that, in terms of our budget, would mean reductions in those sectors. Hopefully, we have worked proactively to find ways to mitigate the impact. While the headline figures for both higher education and further education are stark, and it's important people do appreciate they are stark, beneath the hood as such there are some degree of mitigating factors that may give some additional spending power, which should allow protection of some degree of frontline services, but there will be a loss, and people should be very conscious of that.
Okay, thank you. Members? Minister, thank you very much for your time, for coming along.
Members?
I'm sure you'll be back in front of us in this issue.
In the very near future.
I'm sure. Derek, Keller, Stephen, thank you very much for your time as well.
Thank you.
Okay, members, for all the business. Members' date, place and time of next meeting. The next meeting will take place tomorrow afternoon. The event begins at 10 a.m. in the Dunsilla Hotel, Ballymena, which is an evidence session into an inquiry into special educational needs post-19, and the committee will meet at 1 p.m. to formally convene to take evidence. Members, meeting's adjourned.
12 o'clock.
Chair, can we just make sure that's started?